Wife passed on a Tuesday in March, and by Friday my son-in-law had already started rearranging the furniture. Not metaphorically, literally. I came downstairs that morning to find the armchair my wife had picked out at a flea market in Vermont, the green one she'd reupholstered herself, twice, sitting out on the front porch with a yellow sticky note that said donation. I stood there in my socks looking at that chair for a long time. I didn't say anything. That was probably the moment my son-in-law, I'll call him my son-in-law, because that's what he was for, 11 years, and that's the only name that matters here, decided I was a pushover. Maybe he'd already decided before that, but that morning, watching me stand there and say nothing, I think he confirmed it for himself. My daughter, Joanna, she had her mother's stubbornness and her grandfather's laugh, and a way of making any room feel smaller and warmer at the same time. She'd been sick for 14 months, pancreatic cancer, the fast-moving kind. We had some good days in there. We had some terrible ones too. She passed at 51 years old, which is not old enough by any measure I know of. What my son-in-law did not know, what almost nobody knew, was that I had been carrying a secret for 31 years. And I'd gotten so comfortable carrying it that it almost didn't feel like a secret anymore. It just felt like the quiet part of my life, the part that didn't need announcing. I grew up in a small town in central Ohio. My father worked at a tire plant. My mother cleaned houses on weekends. We weren't poor exactly, but we counted things. We counted a lot. I got a partial scholarship to Ohio State, worked nights at a loading dock, graduated with a civil engineering degree and about $14,000 in debt. That felt like a mountain back then. I paid it off in 3 years, and then something clicked in my head that never fully unclicked. I started reading. Not novels. Financial books, real estate law, property investment guides. Boring stuff that most people my age were too busy living to bother with. I drove a used Buick until it had 200,000 miles on it. I brought lunch to work every day for a decade. While my colleagues were buying boats, I was buying a duplex in Columbus for $38,000, and then another one, and then a small commercial property on the east side of town that a hardware store had abandoned. By the time I was 40, I had built something real, nothing flashy. A small private real estate holding company, just me and a part-time accountant named Beverly who knew where all the bodies were buried, financially speaking. I kept it quiet because I'd watched too many people get loud about money and then lose it or lose something else. I never wanted my daughter to grow up thinking money was the point of anything. I never wanted my wife to feel like our life together was a transaction. So I drove the same kind of sensible cars. I wore the same kind of sensible clothes. I lived in the same house in the same neighborhood in Worthington, Ohio, that we bought in 1991 for $162,000. And that house is where this story really starts. My daughter met her husband at a work conference in Cincinnati. He was in sales, mid-level management, the kind of guy who was always about to close a big deal. Confident in that particular way where you can't quite tell if the confidence is built on something solid or if it's the whole structure. I tried to like him. I did like him for a while. He was funny at holidays. He remembered birthdays. He had a good handshake and looked you in the eye when he talked to you. They got married in 2013. They moved into an apartment in Dublin, Ohio, near where he worked. Then my wife got her first diagnosis. Breast cancer, 2016. And things started to shift. My daughter wanted to be closer. Her husband had just been passed over for a regional director position he'd been counting on, which meant they were stretched thin on a single decent salary and a lot of dinners out and a lease payment on a truck that I never understood the need for. My wife and I talked, and we made a decision. We told them they could move into our house. There was more than enough room. My wife wanted her daughter close. I wanted to make it work, and I was honest with them. I said, I'll cover the mortgage, the property taxes, the utilities. You don't have to worry about any of that. You just take care of each other and take care of your mother. What I did not say, because it wasn't relevant at the time, and I have always been a man who says the relevant things, is that the house had been paid off since 2008. There was no mortgage. The mortgage I was referring to was actually just my own money going into my own account. I paid all the bills. I kept all the records. My name was on everything. My son-in-law never asked. I think he assumed, as a lot of people might, that I was just a retired engineer supplementing Social Security with savings. I let him assume. I didn't correct it. That was my choice, and I've thought about it many times since. We had 4 good years, actually. My wife went into remission in 2017. My daughter and I would have coffee on the back porch on weekend mornings, and she'd tell me about work, and I'd tell her about nothing in particular, and it was enough. It was a lot, actually. Then my wife's cancer came back in 2021. Different site, more aggressive. She was gone by April of 2022, and my son-in-law started rearranging furniture. I don't want to be unfair to him. Grief does strange things to people. But looking back, I think what I witnessed in those weeks after my wife's funeral wasn't grief exactly. It was calculation. He'd been in that house for 6 years by then. He knew the neighborhood, knew the square footage, knew what the houses on our street had sold for during the COVID run-up. I caught him on Zillow one afternoon. He didn't close the laptop when he saw me. That was the first thing that I noticed. The second thing was the woman who started appearing on Friday evenings. My wife had been dead for 22 days when this happened. I want you to hold that number. 22 days. I came home from having dinner with an old colleague to find a woman I'd never met sitting at my wife's kitchen table, drinking wine from my wife's good glasses. My son-in-law introduced her like I was a neighbor stopping by, first name only. She worked with him, apparently. She had a nice smile and was very clearly uncomfortable, which told me she had more self-awareness than he did. I said goodnight and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time that night. The next morning, my son-in-law knocked on my bedroom door. He was in his weekend clothes, holding a cup of coffee like this was going to be a casual conversation. He sat down in the chair by the window, my wife's reading chair, and he told me he'd been thinking. He said he thought it might be time for me to consider my options. I asked him what he meant by that. He said the house was a lot for one person to raffle around in. He said he and his friend, he used the word friend, had been talking, and they thought it might be better for everyone if I found a place that was more suited to where I was in life. He mentioned a few senior communities in the area. He said some of them were quite nice. He said he'd be happy to help me look. I remember his exact words because I wrote them down that night. He said, "You've had a good long run here, Walt. But this chapter's closing, and there's no shame in that. My name is not Walt. My name is Walter, and my wife was the only person who ever called me Walt, and she has been gone for 23 days. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said I appreciated him sharing that with me, and that I'd give it some thought. He looked relieved. That was the tell. He expected an argument, and when he didn't get one, he visibly relaxed. He patted my knee on the way out. Patted my knee. I let 2 weeks pass. During those 2 weeks I watched. He had the locks rekeyed, told me he'd lost his spare key, and the locksmith was coming anyway. He started parking in the center of the 2-car garage, which left me no room for my car. He had the cable account changed to his name. These were small things, but they were deliberate things, and I noticed all of them. On a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after our conversation, he slid a piece of paper across the kitchen table to me. It was a printout of a 1-bedroom apartment in a 55-plus community in Westerville. He'd already made some calls, he said. They had availability. He thought it was a good fit. He asked if I wanted him to schedule a tour. I looked at the paper for a moment. I said, "How much is the monthly fee?" He told me. It was $3,100 a month. I said, "And you think my Social Security covers that?" He shrugged. He said there were probably some assistance programs. He said he could look into it. He said it with the same tone you'd use to tell someone their car needs new tires. I folded the paper in half and set it down. I told him I needed a little more time to think. He sighed. Not an annoyed sigh, a patient one, which was somehow worse, and said of course whenever I was ready. I called my accountant Beverly the next morning. Beverly has worked with me for 22 years. She's seen the whole arc of what I built, and she has never once treated it like it was ordinary. I told her what was happening. I told her what I needed. She said, "Walter, are you sure?" I said I was sure. She said, "Okay then. This is going to be interesting." I also called my attorney, a man named Hugh who I've worked with since the mid-90s. Hugh is not dramatic. Hugh is the kind of person who communicates entirely in facts, and occasionally a dry observation that, if you're paying attention, is actually very funny. I told Hugh everything. He listened without interrupting, which is a rare skill. When I finished, he said, "The deed has been in your name the entire time." I said yes. "Paid off in 2008, not a dollar owed." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then this is very simple, Walter, and also very satisfying. My daughter. I have to tell you something about her that I've been circling around because it's the part that hurts the most to say clearly. She knew. Not everything. She didn't know the full scope of what I had built over 30 years. But she knew the house was mine. She grew up in that house. She knew I'd paid it off. She knew the bills had always come to me. And in those 6 years they lived with us. She never said anything to him about it because she had convinced herself it wasn't relevant, or she was protecting her marriage, or she didn't want the conflict. I understand that. I understood it even before she was gone. What she did do about 2 years before she died was call Hugh and ask him to add a specific clause to my estate documents. She called him directly. She made the appointment herself. She didn't tell me until later over coffee on that back porch. And she was matter-of-fact about it the way she was matter-of-fact about most things. She said, "Dad, I just want to make sure everything is documented, the way it should be." I asked her if there was something worrying her. She looked at her coffee cup for a second. Then she said, "I just know how he is about money. And I love him, but I know how he is. I didn't push it further. I should have, but I didn't." 6 weeks after my son-in-law handed me the apartment printout, my attorney called him and my daughter's best friend, who had been named as a secondary executor, and 3 other family members I should mention, my brother-in-law, my wife's sister, and my daughter's closest friend from college, and invited them all to his office for what he described as a routine reading of my daughter's estate documents. My son-in-law came in looking the way he always looked in professional settings. Jacket, no tie. That particular expression that says, "I know what this is about and I've already thought it through." Hugh read through the standard documents first. My daughter's personal effects, which were distributed quietly and had already mostly been handled. A small account she'd had in her own name since before the marriage, which she'd left to a literacy non-profit she'd volunteered with for years. A piece of jewelry to her college friend. That sort of thing. Then Hugh set down the papers he'd been reading from and picked up a different folder. He said, "There is one additional matter that pertains to the Property Act." And he read our street address. He read through the title, History, the original purchase in 1991, the payoff in 2008, every tax record, every utility account, every insurance policy. He read them slowly, because Hugh understands that pacing matters in moments like this. My son-in-law's expression didn't change at first. He was waiting for the point. Hugh got to the point. He explained that the property had never been transferred, never been refinanced in another name, never held jointly. That my daughter had, in fact, had no legal ownership interest in the property at any time. That she had been, along with her husband, a resident of a property owned entirely and solely by me. He set the folder down. My son-in-law said, "What?" Hugh said, "The house belongs to Walter. It has always belonged to Walter. Your wife understood this, which is why she arranged for this documentation to be formally included in these proceedings." The room was very quiet. My son-in-law turned to look at me. I was sitting 2 chairs down from him, and I had not said a word through any of it. And I was not going to start now. He said, "You knew this whole time." I didn't answer that, because it wasn't a question worth answering. He said, and I could hear something changing in his voice, not quite anger yet, more like a man trying to find a foothold on something that's moved. "You let me believe," I said very calmly. "I never told you anything." He pushed back from the table. He said something about lawyers, and about how this couldn't be right, and about how he'd lived there for 6 years. Hugh told him, still entirely without drama, that tenancy at will does not create property rights in Ohio, and that as the sole owner, I was within my legal rights to resume primary residency at any time. My wife's sister, who is 74 years old and has never in my presence said anything cutting to anyone, said, "Seems like you should have asked." She said it very quietly. To no one in particular. She was looking at her hands. My son-in-law left the office without shaking anyone's hand. I sat in Hugh's office for a while after everyone else had gone. Hugh poured 2 cups of coffee from the machine in his break room and handed me one and sat down across from me. I said, "Was that satisfying?" He considered this for a moment. He said, "It was appropriate," which from Hugh is high praise. The woman, the one with the nice smile who'd been at my kitchen table 22 days after my wife died, she was already gone by the time I moved my things back into the main bedroom. I don't know when exactly she left. I suspect she had more information than my son-in-law gave her credit for, and she made a quiet decision of her own. I bore her no grudge. She was a footnote in someone else's mistake. My son-in-law moved out over a long weekend in May. He was efficient about it. He took what was his and left what wasn't, which was honestly better behavior than I'd expected. Before he drove away with the last load, he stopped at the end of the driveway and looked back at the house for a moment. I was watching from the front window. I don't know what he saw when he looked at it. I know what I saw. The porch my father helped me repaint in 1995. The window my daughter used to climb out of as a teenager thinking I didn't know. The garden bed my wife started, and I've kept up every spring since because the tulips don't know she's gone. And I see no reason to tell them. I've been asked a few times since then whether I feel bad about how it went, whether I should have said something earlier, given him more of a chance. Here's what I've come to. I gave him a chance every day for 6 years. I gave him a warm house and no bills and a family. I gave him coffee and holidays and the benefit of every doubt I had. What I didn't give him was information he never bothered to ask for about a house he walked into and assumed was his by proximity. My daughter made one request of me in the last year of her life. She sat on that back porch and drank her coffee and told me, without making a thing of it, that she wanted everything documented the way it should be. I think what she meant was, "I see you, Dad, and I want to make sure someone says so out loud, even if I'm not there to say it." So in the end, she's the one who made sure the truth came out. Not me. I take my coffee out to the back porch most mornings now. It's quieter than it used to be in all kinds of ways. The green chair is back inside, by the window where it belongs. Some mornings I sit in it. Some mornings I sit in my own chair and look at hers, and that's enough. The tulips came back this spring. They always do. There's a version of this story where I say something clever in that kitchen, where I stop him mid-sentence and lay out every document on the table and watch his face change right then and there. I've thought about that version. It would have felt good for about 10 minutes. But here's what I've come to understand, sitting on that back porch with my coffee and a lot of quiet mornings to think it through. The way a thing ends has a lot to do with how honestly it was built in the first place. My son-in-law didn't lose that house because I outmaneuvered him. He lost it because he never once stopped to ask a single question about the ground he was standing on. That's not bad luck. That's the natural consequence of a life lived entirely on assumptions. I built what I built over 31 years because I paid attention, not just to numbers and deeds and property tax records, though those mattered. I paid attention to what was real and what wasn't. I learned early that the people who confuse confidence for knowledge are usually the ones who end up most surprised. My son-in-law was a confident man. He just wasn't a careful one. And in the long run, those two things are not interchangeable. My daughter was the smartest person I knew. She saw it clearly. She saw him clearly. And she still loved him. And she still made a quiet decision 2 years before she died to walk into an attorney's office and make sure the record was straight. That took something. Not anger, not revenge. Just a clear-eyed willingness to face an uncomfortable truth and do the right thing with it, even when it cost her something emotionally. That kind of honesty is harder than it sounds. Most people choose the easier path of looking away. She didn't, and I kept going. Through her mother's illness, through her own, through the long months of watching the person you raised from a small, loud child become someone you genuinely admire. I kept the properties maintained and the records clean, and the tulips coming back every spring. not because I was building toward a moment of satisfaction, though I won't pretend the moment in Hugh's office wasn't something. I kept going because stopping never made sense to me. You do the work, you stay steady. You don't make noise about what you built until the noise becomes necessary. What I want anyone to take from this, if there's something to take, is that none of it happened by accident. The outcome followed directly from the choices over decades. His choices, mine, my daughter's. Cause and effect isn't poetic. It isn't dramatic. It's just what happens when you add up enough days of who someone actually is. Be the person who asks the questions. Be the person who does the quiet work. And when someone tries to tell you that your chapter is closing, make sure you know exactly whose name is on the deed before you pack a single box. My daughter knew. She made sure I knew she knew. That's the thing I carry with me most.